I'm talking today with Charlie English about his new book, The Gallery of Miracles and Madness. It tells the story of modern art's love affair with an extraordinary collection of psychiatric art known as the Prinzhorn collection, and the political consequences of that connection with madness after Hitler came to power. In their so-called degenerate art shows, the Nazis placed works by psychiatric patients alongside those by professional modern artists. Later, they would drive modern artists out of Germany and begin a mass murder campaign against the patients. It's a brilliant book, and it's a surprising book. It's a beautifully written book by Charlie. I have to admit I used to work with him, but I'm not biased. I'd still tell you if it wasn't. It's really beautifully written, and it's a fantastically researched book about the art of the time. But what makes it amazing as well, it's a brilliant way to tell, and a really devastating way to tell the story of Nazi Germany, of the Holocaust and what preempts the Holocaust. And in a way, it's also a psychological portrait of Hitler. Charlie, how did you get into this story? Why did you want to tell it, and how did you find out about it?
Well, good question. I mean, I've always been quite interested in madness as a sort of thing. I mean, I love that Simon Winchester book about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary, and about the man who was in the Bethlehem hospital sending him definitions. So I was exploring really what book I should be looking into after writing about Africa, and I found Richard Dadd, who was this another Bethlehem inmate, who again a great artist, and was looking at him, and I sort of found myself going deeper and deeper into this kind of idea of schizophrenia and art. And then I came across the Prinzhorn collection, which I didn't really know anything about before then, and I just thought the story was incredible. I mean, it's a complicated story. It goes over quite a long period of time, but it seemed to me to cover so much of the kind of 20th century, fascinating 20th century history, and I just thought this is the one that I would want to work on.
The art is really interesting, but the art is a way of telling the story of the Second World War, Hitler, the Holocaust, and it's a way of looking into his mind, isn't it?
One of the great ironies of the book is that I'm writing about insane artists, but Hitler is obviously borderline insane, diagnosed insane by various people, or at least with psychological difficulties. And of course, he thinks he's an artist. And even, Thomas Mann said he was an artist. Even really late in Hitler's career, he said, you've got to recognize that Hitler is a kind of artist, and his politics was a kind of art, and it was a sort of theatrical display, a lot of it, and a lot of that stuff that Albert Speer did, that Hitler supervised, of those great stage sets and the searchlights and the marching men, is a sort of performance, I suppose. But also his greatest work, I think, as he would have seen it, I mean, the most terrible work was that he was recreating the German people. I mean, he was literally trying to re-engineer the German people. And there's this cartoon in the book from a satirical magazine which shows, I think it's called the Artist in Chief, or the Sculptor of Germany, and it's Hitler. He's got this clay model of people fighting, and he just smashes it with his fist and builds it into this Aryan Superman. And I think that's what he thought he was doing. I mean, it was completely crazy. I mean, and none of it makes any sense, and it's perverted and disgusting. But that's what he seemed to think he was doing.
Was the art a kind of template for what he wanted the Uberman to be? The art of these, kind of blonde, super muscled people.
Yeah. I mean, they believed, the kind of Nazi cultural theorists believed that art was a symptom of the sort of genetic health of the race, of the Aryan German race. So the art that modernists were producing in Germany, because it didn't show kind of realistic or heroic figures. I mean, they were not interested in that. Their art was much better than that. They were trying to depict a sort of inner truth about themselves. But that for him was a sort of a sign of the degeneracy of the Germans. And so the art he wanted, which he filled his own massive art gallery with in Munich, was all of these kind of heroic types, blonde women with lots of children, people draped in flags, all that kind of stuff, which was absolutely terrible. And all the good stuff was actually in the Degenerate Art show down the road.
Let's go back to the interest in madness after the First World War. Why was it after the First World War that so many artists wanted to look inside the head and wanted the inside of the head to be reflected in the outer body?
Well, it's partly to do with Freud, I think. I mean, Freud's ideas were really only kind of seeping through to a kind of more general audience in the early 20th century. And, he sort of created this idea that there was this fascinating space inside every single human, and that this was a kind of new terrain that could be explored. It's partly to do with the idea of modernism itself, which, in the kind of 19th century, art was really about depicting. I mean, there was a system of training artists through the art academies who basically spent their time dealing with classical mythology and sort of biblical themes. And there were certain subjects that were suitable for art to portray, and there were very beautiful, detailed paintings. But in an era when everybody was moving into these massive industrializing cities and being sort of torn out of the rural agrarian society into the urban industrial society, this stuff seemed completely irrelevant. So they wanted to look at new themes. They wanted to get rid of this idea of the kind of academy classical art. And so they began exploring different types of human experience and looking at what they called primitivism, which was, at that time, a lot of colonial objects were coming back to Europe, totems from kind of newly discovered lands. So they looked at those sorts of things, and they looked at the art of children and the art of the insane. And for them, it was a way of kind of trying to connect with what humans were really all about, what the kind of uncensored, uneducated, uncivilized humanity was about.
How important was it that they had just come out of the First World War?
Well, the war was another massive driver towards this, because obviously you had 20 million plus people killed, bereavement in trauma in practically every household in Europe. There was a whole new kind of psychological dimension to life in and after the war. And artists themselves have been traumatized in the war. I mean, there's a kind of long list of expressionists who had nervous breakdowns during the fighting, and a couple of them were killed. Käthe Kollwitz's son was killed, and she spent the rest of her life basically depicting what that felt like. So again, that was another driver towards insanity. And Andre Breton and the Surrealists particularly really took up that kind of insane baton. They developed an almost they almost worshipped madness by the kind of early 1920s.
I want to look at some of the characters in the book, because it's driven in a way by two main characters. One is Hans Prinzhorn, who started the collection that we talk about, and the other is the psychiatric patient and artist whose narrative you also tell throughout the book.
Yeah.
Will you tell me about both of them?
Okay. Well, Hans Prinzhorn was a sort of the son of a kind of fairly well-to-do family from North Germany. He was extremely well educated, incredibly intelligent. By the age of sort of 30, he had a doctorate in art history and also a medical degree. And he was also a veteran of the war. He'd fought in 1918. I mean, he was a medic, but he was at the front in kind of mid 1918. And after the war, he joined the psychiatric clinic at Heidelberg University, which is a really famous, prestigious place where really the idea of modern psychiatry that we have today was created. I mean, German psychiatry was probably at the forefront of world psychiatry, and Heidelberg was at the forefront of that. So he began collecting this art there in 1919, and over 2 years or so collected about 5,000 or 6,000 pieces from psychiatric institutions all over the German-speaking world. And one of the people he collected was Franz Karl Bühler, who is the, if you like, the hero of the book, or the main character of the book. Bühler was a blacksmith. He was brilliant. He went to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 and won a gold medal for his smithing work, which was the height of his profession really at the time. But he also had mental health problems, visions, and at a particularly stressful period in his life when he was sacked from a big job he had, he sort of lost control and became really the victim of his own sort of psychosis, and he thought people were pursuing him and chasing him and saying things to him when they obviously weren't. He was a kind of, I suppose he was a paranoid schizophrenic, you'd say today. And he was incarcerated as a mental health patient in Germany from 1898, and started painting or drawing and teaching himself really to become an artist from about 1898 onwards. And as he spent time in the asylum, he got more and more, better and better at art. And Prinzhorn and Bühler met in 1920. And Bühler was the kind of highlight of Prinzhorn's collection as Prinzhorn saw it. And he discovered what he called 10 schizophrenic masters in this exercise of looking at psychiatric art. And of these, he thought Bühler was the most outstanding.
Did he think Bühler was a great artist?
Yeah, he thought Bühler was. He compared him to Van Gogh and Dürer, and he thought he would stand with the professionals as one of the great artists of his time.
This is his famous self-portrait, and I looked at that, and the first thing I thought of was the Scream. And yeah. I asked you about it, and you said he would have been very unlikely to have seen the Scream or known of Edward Munch, because I think he was already in an asylum by the time Edward Munch was doing his stuff. And it surprised me that someone who knew some kind of art expert, which both of us certainly are, like years and years later, discovered that there might be something similar to him and Munch. But it is kind of very classic, kind of, is it the word expressionist?
Yeah.
one of the things that seems astonishing in a way is that Hitler, and I suppose a lot of people at the time, were convinced that you couldn't create great art if you had a psychiatric illness. Whereas I think now we almost assume that many of the great artists will have some kind of psychiatric illness to give them their vision. I mean, you know, kind of no one thinks Van Gogh was particularly sane, but Hitler did believe. Was he unusual at the time in thinking dogmatically that someone who had a mental illness could not produce art?
I don't think he was unusual. I think he was a sort of cultural conservative. I mean, an extreme, you could argue, artistic conservative, and he just thought, as did a whole sweep of society at that point, not just in Germany, that this whole idea of the madness connected to art was a sort of was damaging to art and damaging to society. And I mean, I often think of, you know, when you and I were kind of on the arts desk, and you know, some piece of contemporary British art would come across the desk, and there is a sort of natural response, I think, among a lot of people when they see a radical piece of art, to kind of think, oh, well, that's just rubbish, isn't it? I mean, that's just rubbish. And you know, there was a long period when the tabloid press were sort of attacking young British artists for just producing rubbish. I mean, the Tracy Emin tent and things like that. And I think there is a natural conservatism in most societies towards this kind of stuff. And maybe it's not surprising, because the artists are trying to push the boundaries all the time, and they're not trying to be, perhaps in the 20s they weren't deliberately trying to be controversial, but who knows, who cares? I mean, they're trying to push into new terrain, and so most or a lot of people don't like it. And so and at the same time, I think there was a sense that artists in the 19th century had been held up as kind of visionaries who had a special talent and could somehow see the future of society. You know, they could see things that other people didn't see, and were put on a pedestal in that way. And so for these new kids on the block to come in and start meddling with mental illness, I mean, I think a lot of people were pretty horrified by it.
And they were showing something that people literally couldn't see. So, you know, they were externalizing the internal, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And people, I mean, it was a different time. I don't think people wanted that to be done in a variety of ways. I mean, I don't think people perhaps talked about things in the same way. So people who represented it so graphically were not always going to be welcomed.
I read the book. In a way, what fascinated me most was it's like a personal story for Hitler. It's almost like a revenge story. Do you know what I mean? It almost seems to be like, you know, it seems almost kind of a glib way of looking at it, to say it for me, but I don't think it is. You can actually read Nazi Germany, the millions killed, as his revenge on the art world. I mean, he, at the very beginning, in his early days, he was rejected by art school, wasn't he? And it almost seems as if he's spending the next few years eradicating that which didn't give him his place. Do you think that's going over the top? I mean, when I think he didn't like you were saying earlier, he didn't simply want to build a society, he wanted to create it physically, and he almost saw him as the master artist of a country. I felt it was like, okay, fine, you reject me from your school, fuck it, I will be the artist of Germany, if not the world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think his sort of revenge, he had great requirement for revenge. In a sense, his politics was the politics of revenge. It was revenge against the people who had humiliated Germany in the First World War. It was revenge against the art academies who had rejected him. I mean, long into his life, he was bemoaning the art academies and how he could teach them a thing or two and how they knew nothing about art. So, I mean, obviously, you have to be careful of saying that millions of people were killed because he was kicked out of art school, but there is, you can imagine one of those kind of Robert Harris alternative reality stories in which he's accepted into art school and then nothing happens.
No, I mean, it could almost be as simple as that, which is, I mean, he obviously, I mean, he was a genocidalist, but perhaps he could have been stopped.
Yeah. I mean, he was a tremendously angry individual, even as a young man. I mean, but I think, I think it's fascinating to read about his early life in Vienna. I mean, the childhood, the only childhood friend he really had was this guy called August Kubizek, and they lived together for a short time in Vienna, having grown up together more or less, been teenage friends. And Kubizek got into the conservatoire to study music. He was a musician, and Adolf failed to get into the academy, but then pretended that he'd got in because he was so embarrassed. And there were months where he sort of had to pretend to go out every day to the academy and then come back and see his friend. And I mean, can you imagine the sort of humiliation that he was inflicting on himself? Because it was obviously someone was going to find out. And they lived in a very, very small room together, and Hitler would kind of march up and down the floor shouting about everything and how terrible everything was. And Kubizek would have to go to bed because there wasn't enough room in the room for him to be standing up while Hitler was marching about shouting. And if he fell asleep, then Hitler would wake him up and shout at him for falling asleep. I mean, there's sort of anger in this person, even really before too much had befallen him, is quite astonishing. So I think, well, I suppose what I'm trying to say is his makeup was really geared towards what happened all along.
What did he make of the degenerate art, and how did he react to it?
Well, whether for political reasons or because he believed it, he absolutely kind of excoriated it. I mean, in Mein Kampf already in the mid-20s, he's talking about Dada and Cubism being I think it's the excrescences of degenerate men or something like that. And he's early on, he's calling for a return to the kind of German values in art, which means basically destroying all the kind of modernism, which he blamed that on the Jews. I mean, he developed an elaborate conspiracy theory that it was all kind of communists and Jews that were deliberately trying to destroy German culture with modern art, with degenerate modern art. And it's all a nonsense, but it's it seemed to strike a chord with some people in the on the kind of conservative side of the German electorate. And
he effectively ordered the German nation to humiliate these artists, didn't he, by comparing them with the artists from the mental hospitals.
Yeah, I mean, when
a bit about that.
When they started putting on these shaming shows, as they were called, these degenerate art shows from 1937 onwards, they were propaganda shows designed to shame modern art and show that it was a kind of conspiracy against the Germans. And from the second stage of that touring show, which was in Berlin, they added Prinzhorn's psychiatric art into the mix. So they would have like a professional artist, Oskar Kokoschka or somebody, and then they would have next to that, they would place a Prinzhorn artist, and they would have a kind of crowing, sarcastic caption saying, which one of these is the mad one? You'll be surprised. This is by Oskar Kokoschka, and the one on the right is by a genuine lunatic from an asylum. And so they used Prinzhorn's collection to defame modernism in that way. And those psychiatric pieces and the professional pieces went around Germany they toured Germany well into the war years, basically to prove this conspiracy theory that the Nazis were putting out there, that degeneracy was a kind of Jewish communist conspiracy.
Is it right that it's still the largest selling show ever? What's the name of the degeneracy show? The
Untitled Kunst is what it was called in German. It just means degenerate art. It's the most visited art exhibition of all time. Something like 3 million people went to see it. You didn't have to pay. I mean, part of the show, the showmanship, if you like, was that it was free to get into, because that showed that the art inside was not worth paying to see. And the Nazis would bus in people. They'd lay on special trains to get people to come to it. They would keep it open till 9 o'clock at night. So if you worked, you could come after work, weekends. They were really pushing this very hard. And something like 2 million people saw it in Munich, and then another 1.3 or so as it toured the country after that. So it was a really, really big deal in Germany at the time.
But this was just a start, wasn't it? I mean, first of all came the humiliation, and then when the book gets incredibly dark and horrifying is when we see where that humiliation then leads to for both the modern artists and for the patients who had been diagnosed with mental illness.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically is this conspiracy theory is taken, this pseudoscientific theory is taken to its kind of absolute logical endpoint. And what that means in practice is that not only are German art galleries cleared of all the great expressionist and modern art that they have in their collections, which are some of the best in the world, not only does that happen, not only are statues ripped down all over Germany, not only are artists expelled from the country or forced to flee or banned from painting. I mean, some of them, for instance, are terrified that the Gestapo are going to come and smell their oil paints, so they start working in watercolor instead, in very small pictures. Not only that, but this theory of degeneracy, in which the idea is put about that there is a genetic threat to the Germans because of the sort of pollution of their blood by inferior members of the species. The logical endpoint of that means that they start in 1939 actually killing people, and they start with the psychiatric patients. And the first action, which is called Action T4, is the moment when they develop the kind of gassing technology. They have a kind of experiment in Brandenburg, just outside Berlin, where they put psychiatric patients into they basically gas them with carbon monoxide to see how quickly it works, and then they think that works well, and then they build a killing center at the place called Grafeneck, just outside Stuttgart, and they convert a coach shed into a gas chamber, and it's all given the gloss of being a kind of medical treatment, and they make doctors do all this. Not that some of the doctors are unwilling to do it, but it's the medical profession that they want to be administering the gas. And they take about 70,000 patients from their institutions and put them into gas chambers from about January 1940 in Action T4. And Bühler is gassed in that way in Grafeneck in March 1940. But it's the same techniques, the same staff, even the same pretense that there's a shower room that's actually a gas chamber. All these things are then relocated to Poland when they start the final solution later in the war, and it becomes the prototype, if you like, for the Holocaust.
Were you glad when you'd finished it? Did it? We were glad to get it.
You're always glad when you finish a book, Simon. I don't see it as a sort of, I mean, it is a horror story in part, but I don't see the whole thing as a horror story. I see it as a sort of, in the end, it's a celebration of schizophrenic art. I mean, it's about. And
is that the miracle in the title?
Well, the miracles. There's actually a Prinzhorn artist who saw miracles in his shoe insoles. I don't know if you remember that bit, but he had sweat-stained shoe insoles, and he would see Christ and God and Mary and various religious figures in the sweat stains of his shoe insoles. So, and he thought these were miracles. So those are the actual miracles, but it's a miracle that the collection survived the war and that it's still there, and it's grown now. I mean, there are 20,000 works in it, and it's still, and it's showing that art isn't just done by an elite. You know, it's extended the idea of and the meaning of art, really, to encompass a whole new bunch of people.
Beautiful. Hey, Charlie, thanks so much for talking to me about this. I was going to say the Gallery of Miracles and Madness. It's really, really good on loads of fronts. I don't read many books because I'm a bit of an ignoramus, but I advise you, read it.